Torrential rain swamped this weather-blighted Masters, and with fairways and greens flooding, organisers were left with no alternative other than to call off play for the day. The tournament is now way behind schedule, and with a damp Sunday forecast, there are questions over whether it will spill over into a fifth day for the first time in 40 years. Brooks Koepka remains out in front at 13 under, facing a tough par putt on the resumption. He's 4 clear of Jon Rahm, with Matt Fitzpatrick in 4th place, the leading Briton 8 shots behind.
Manchester City closed the gap at the top of the English Premier League to 5 points with a resounding 4-1 win against Southampton at St Mary's. Elsewhere, Son Heung-min scored his 100th English Premier League goal in Tottenham's 2-1 win over Brighton. Manchester United maintained their push for a top 4 finish with a 2-0 win over Everton at Old Trafford, and there were victories for Wolves, Newcastle, Aston Villa, Bournemouth and West Ham. League leaders Arsenal are in action on Sunday when they travel to face Liverpool. The Gunners' boss Mikel Arteta says Anfield is always a tough place to go, regardless of the form Liverpool are in.
Things happening that are costing them points, that's for sure. But at home, you've seen a different kind of team, and we know how it is to play there, and we have prepared for that, expecting the best possible Liverpool, and us being the best that we can be. And if we do that, we're going to have a chance to win the game.
In cricket, the England white ball captain Jos Buttler's 79 off 51 helped set up Rajasthan Royals' 57-run win over Delhi Capitals in the Indian Premier League, and the 4-time Olympic gold medalist Mo Farah finished 7th in the Port Gentil 10K in Gabon on Saturday as he continues his preparations for his final London Marathon later this month.
Paul Sarahs. Hundreds of representatives of charities and community organisations have been invited to King Charles's coronation service at Westminster Abbey here in London on Saturday, May the 6th. Many of them are recipients of the British Empire Medal, which is awarded to people who make an important contribution to their local community. Helena Wilkinson reports.
Among those who will be at the coronation service will be heads of state and other royals from around the world. But at the heart of the congregation will be hundreds of local heroes from across the country. More than 450 people who've been invited here to Westminster Abbey for the coronation service on May the 6th are British Empire Medal recipients. They're people who've been recognised for their achievement or contribution to local communities, and many of them played a big role in supporting during the COVID-19 lockdown. Like Julian and Maria Sturdy-Morton from London. During the pandemic, they arranged food parcels for people in need. Just tell us the moment that you found out that you were going to be invited.
Well, Julian phoned me, I was out, and said, have you looked at your emails? And I said, no. He said, well, we've got this email. I think it's a scam. Well, you would do, wouldn't you?
Don't touch anything. Don't click anything.
And then we found out it wasn't a scam, and he burst into tears, and I did as well. Well, we still can't quite believe it, but it's amazing. I just can't think of the words.
It's very emotional. It's very strange, because there seem to be so many other people who should be there, or could be there, or have a greater call on being there, and I'm not giving them my ticket.
400 young people representing charities chosen by the King and the Queen Consort and the government are also being invited to a special private viewing of the service at this church, St Margaret's, next to the Abbey. They include members of organisations like the Scouts and St John's Ambulance, who'll be providing support across London on Coronation Day. Around 2,000 guests are expected to be invited to the coronation service, which is just a month away. For some, there are already important decisions to be made. What are you going to wear, Maria?
Well, I think it depends on the weather. So layers, I think, it's going to have to, and flat shoes.
And a hat.
And a hat, but flat shoes, definitely.
Helena Wilkinson reporting, and that's all from the newsroom for now. For myself, Nigel Adderley, thanks for listening. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, bringing you a year-long investigation into a global criminal network.
I'm Simona Weinglass, an investigative reporter. I'm on the trail of a crime syndicate believed to have stolen more than $1 billion.
They are very well organized. They're operating across borders, different countries.
I've been speaking to a victim who lost her life savings. So how much did you lose total?
$30,000. I just felt sick in the pit of my stomach and humiliated.
And a former employee who decided to take a stand.
I had a fear to get caught. I didn't sleep well for months.
I uncover a web of deceit.
What can you say to somebody whose greed is so great that they're happy to destitute somebody, their hearts are stone?
The $1 billion scam. Wednesday at 10:30 and 21:30 GMT.
Hello, I'm Claudia Hammond. After the news, I'll be here with Health Check. There's been a lot of chat recently about ChatGPT, the new artificial intelligence tool that can write essays, summarise meetings and answer questions. But can it be trusted to provide medical advice to doctors and patients? It's already been tried and we'll be looking at the evidence. And how come the majority of health workers around the world are women, but most of those in charge of healthcare are men? All coming up in Health Check.
BBC News with David Harper. Hundreds of Palestinians have barricaded themselves inside Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, raising fears of further clashes with Israeli police. Jordan, which manages the religious complex, has warned of catastrophic consequences if police storm the mosque, as they did earlier in the week. The Israeli military says artillery units have shelled Syrian territory after rockets were fired towards Israel. It also said it also used a drone to attack the rocket launchers. Police in Iran say they are installing cameras in public places to identify and penalise women who violate the strict Islamic dress code by not wearing the hijab. An increasing number of women in Iran have been refusing to wear the veil after a young woman died while in custody of the morality police last year. A Saudi delegation has arrived in the Iranian capital Tehran to discuss procedures for reopening its embassy and consulate there 7 years after the kingdom cut diplomatic relations. Saudi officials are also reported to have arrived in Yemen in the latest diplomatic moves. The authorities in Burkina Faso say 44 civilians were killed in 2 attacks in the northern region of Sahel when assailants targeted the villages of Curacao and Tondobi on Thursday and Friday. Washington has urged China to show restraint after it launched military drills around Taiwan, hours after the Taiwanese president Tsai Ing-wen's return home from a trip to the United States. More than 100,000 people in the Canadian province of Quebec are still without electricity 4 days after an ice storm caused severe disruption to the power grid. Quebec's power company says electricity should be restored by Monday. Ben Ferencz, the last prosecutor at the Nazi war crimes trials, has died at the age of 103. He was the chief prosecutor in the case against SS death squads in the Nuremberg trials. Mr. Ferencz was born to a Romanian Jewish family that emigrated to the US. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to Health Check from the BBC. I'm Claudia Hammond, and every week we're here to guide you through the latest medical findings and to discuss what they mean for you. And to help me today, I have Graham Easton, who's Professor of Clinical Communication Skills at Queen Mary University of London. Welcome back. How are you?
Hi, very well, thanks, Claudia.
And what do you have for us later on?
Well, we're hearing about a worrying rate of burnout around the world in healthcare workers, and also about the idea that antimicrobial resistance in animals and humans is much more closely linked than we may have thought.
And we're also going to be finding out why most of the healthcare workers around the world are women, while most of the people in charge of healthcare services are men, and why it matters for us as patients too. And how complications during pregnancy can result in your baby being half a week younger biologically than its actual age. Weird, I know, but all will be explained. But Graham, I wanted to start by talking to you about artificial intelligence in medicine, because there has been so much chat in the last week about one particular program called ChatGPT after its newest version came out. Now, this is a thing where you can ask it to write essays for you or summarize a meeting or answer questions. So I thought I would put a question to it, and I asked ChatGPT what it is, and it said, this came up on the screen, I am ChatGPT, a large language model trained by OpenAI based on the GPT 3.5 architecture. I have been trained on a massive corpus of text data and can generate human-like responses to a wide range of prompts and questions, and my purpose is to assist users in generating human-like text and provide them with helpful responses to their inquiries. Now, I wonder, Graham, if you could explain this in an even more human-like way for us, Graham. What is it really?
Yeah, human-like. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely caused a big splash in the medical world, and it's passed the toughest of US licensing medical exams, and lots of people are using it to answer their own health queries. I've been playing around with it, actually, and it's really impressive. It creates sort of text-based answers very rapidly to really quite niche medical questions. For example, I asked it to set some multiple choice questions for second year medical students on the subject of ... I'm just playing with it. I'm not doing proper exams, but just for reassurance.
You are going to write the questions, really. I'm glad you told us that.
And also they do need to be checked. That's exactly the point. But they are very good at this sort of textbook type knowledge, which relies on the internet sources that it uses, but not so clever at the messier, real-life problems of real medicine, which require critical thinking, applying this knowledge to an individual person or a situation, where doctors rely on experience, the patient's records, the backstory, and so on.
And so in one study, they got it to take a medical exam, to answer the questions that medical students would have to do to pass their exams, and it did pretty well, didn't it?
It did well, I think, averaging around sort of 80%, so definitely a clear pass, and these are some of the toughest exams there are in medicine.
Now, of course, when I go to my doctor, I don't ask them to sit a medical exam. Maybe I should, but I don't. So where else has it been tried more sort of practically, if you like, in medicine?
Well, that's the issue. So it's very good at this textbook type knowledge. It relies on internet sources, but it's not so clever at answering the kind of messier, real-life clinical problems that come up in real-world medicine. All the things we do train our medical students about. One really interesting study from Stanford University, they looked at those sort of on-the-job questions a clinician might ask about a patient. They might ask another clinician about in the corridor, for example, and they got the chatbot answers, questions like, how would this type of medicine affect the blood sugar in my patient? And they got the chatbot answers reviewed by a panel of experts. Now, 90% of those answered were deemed safe, which meant they didn't do any particular harm, but only around 40% agreed with the specialist in terms of the answer. So around 60% either disagreed with the specialist or were deemed to be irrelevant. And the other interesting is it seems to change its mind if you ask it the same question 3 times over, for example, which they did. Often you get a rather different answer each time, which is a bit disconcerting.
That's a bit weird, isn't it? Very human in a way, but slightly weird. What else have they tried? Where could you see it being really useful in medicine?
Well, what excites me as a family doctor, for example, is how it can summarise what's happened in a consultation for the medical records, your patient notes, which are really important, obviously, for ongoing care, and the same for a discharge summary after you've been in the hospital for a while. It's really time-consuming. It takes up ages of time. It's quite hard to do accurately, and it seems to be very good at doing that, although you still need often to correct it. One paper talked about in the New England Journal of Medicine talked about some example scenarios, and the scenario they tried, it actually got the BMI of the patient wrong.
The body mass index. You want to get that right,
You want to get it right. So that had to be corrected. But that sort of thing could be very helpful.
And we talked in the past on Health Check about using artificial intelligence to do things like look at mammogram scans to see whether a person might have breast cancer or not. And there's a new study on that from the University of Maryland using this new program. Is it good at that?
Yeah, well, so this study was looking at how it offers advice on whether to get screened for breast cancer. And so the researchers asked it 25 different questions, and then they were reviewed. Their answers were reviewed by 3 expert radiologists. They got 22 out of 25 correct, which is not bad, but the ones they got wrong, one response was based on outdated information, so the usual thing, information in equals information out, but the others were either inconsistent or irrelevant. And it's worth saying that sometimes the chatbot makes up stuff. It just seems to make up stuff. They call it hallucinations.
That's weird, isn't it?
Which is very peculiar, and of course that can be really dangerous in medical. And it can be very convincing, so it's quite a convincing
Yes, because it sounds
sometimes.
convincing. Yeah, so maybe humans are going to have to check its workings for a while, but good things in the future.
Well, it's definitely not going away. It's here to stay, and it's likely to improve rapidly. I think one thing is how we evaluate it, not just working on its own, but how we can work with it as a tool to assist in medical decision making, for example. And for patients, I think just like using search engines, but don't rely on the chatbot alone. I think it's important to say it's still important to get advice from a health professional.
Thanks, Graham. Now we're back now to the actual real people you see when you've got something wrong with you. If you go to a clinic or to a hospital, I wonder whether your appointment is more likely to be with a man or a woman. The answer might well be a woman. A new report from the organisation Women in Global Health has found that women hold 70% of the world's jobs in health, the majority as nurses or midwives. But when it comes to the people reaching the top and running health services, 75% are men. Now, for the report, the team reviewed global data, but also did in-depth interviews with health workers in Nigeria, Kenya and India. Dr. Rupa Dutt is a practicing physician in the US and the executive director of Women in Global Health. I asked her whether she was surprised when she found out how few women were in charge.
No, I was not surprised because I am a practicing physician, and when I co-founded Women in Global Health in 2015, it was exactly this reality. I was seeing the hallways where I was doing clinical training with the exact same pattern. The default health leader was a man, whereas women were doing majority of the work. What was surprising was that even all these years that we have been working on advocating for advancing women's leadership, the numbers are stagnant, and shocking to see how much backsliding happened during COVID-19.
And why is it so worrying from a patient perspective? I mean, apart from it not being fair, if women don't get promoted to more senior roles, could we be, I don't know, missing out on the very best people? Why does it matter so much?
Yeah, it's exactly that. We are missing out on the expertise of those that are spending the majority of their time with patients, such as nursing, midwives, community health workers, and all that expertise gets lost, especially when there is decision-making happening. And I can give you an example. In COVID-19, we looked at COVID-19 task teams around the world, and 85% of those were majority men. The first type of service that was often shut down and not considered essential services were access to safe maternal neonatal care. And I can tell you there is not a single woman who would deny that, pregnancy can happen during a pandemic. Similarly, we know that gender-based violence went up almost 30% increase, sometimes even up to 60% in certain countries, and those policies of lockdown were completely gender blind. So when we don't have women at the decision-making table, we know it results in health systems that are weaker and that are not responding to the needs of women.
Well, let's hear from some of the women who are also trying to change things for women health workers. First of all, this is Margaret Odera, and Margaret lives and works in one of the poorer neighbourhoods in Nairobi in Kenya. She was diagnosed with HIV many years ago, and her own experiences inspired her to work as a mentor for women with HIV.
When we were out, maybe a community health worker has been beaten up. There was nothing that could protect this community health worker. No financial protection, no official protection, even if this community health worker gets arrested in the line of duty. It drove me to start advocating for the rights of the community health worker, of which 70% of these community health workers are women. So I thought this is a corporate injustice against women like me. And a woman is compassionate, and the global health fraternity has taken advantage of that. It is just a matter of time that when a wind of another pandemic comes, and the global health fraternity will be on its knees again. And if that community health worker is not strengthened, is not professionalized, is not paid, we will have a demoralized basement in the health structure, and that is very dangerous.
So for Margaret, it's clear that stigma partly came into the way that she was treated as a health worker. But what else have you found stops women from progressing?
There are so many reasons, and Margaret's story also touches upon another aspect, which is that the poorest women are often subsidizing healthcare for all, and so it really creates these multiple disadvantages. The other things that we are seeing is the motherhood penalty. It didn't matter whether someone had children or was planning to have children or didn't have any children. Regardless, they were facing the motherhood penalty. But also for any potential care other roles that they might have. We also found that, men were benefiting from this, and we call this the male bonus, because it's assumed that they're not going to be doing any care responsibilities, even if they are going to be fathers. Other things that really surfaced was the merit myth. Women have been receiving higher education for decades, and even with all of the professional experience, they still are not getting the most senior roles. We take a look at like Nigeria, for example. 1/3 of leadership roles in health organizations are held by women. But when you take a look at the political influence area, only 5 out of 30 national ministers, only 1 out of 28 directors for federal medical centers are women.
And I noticed in your report that it said in Nigeria sometimes women are even getting demoted when they get pregnant.
Exactly. Women go for maternity leave and then they come back and they'll realize that they no longer have their job, or they've been sent to a role post, and this is the motherhood penalty at play.
Now, some of this would be familiar to Snigdha Sen, who's in Kolkata in India. And Snigdha's had a long career in health, which she balances with being a single mother. And now she works as a program manager for an international philanthropic organization.
In the beginning, I was very careerist kind of person, and I think my parents started believing in that. And the secondly is that throughout my career, I am lucky to get a good supervisor and fairly good number of supportive colleagues. If I think of where the problem lies for an woman not to accomplish in their career, parents and family members will expect the women to finish their education as soon as possible and get married. You can finish your nursing course very quickly. In 3 years' time, there will be less number of women become a doctor, but there will be much more number of women who are pursuing their nursing courses. The second hurdle, I will say, I worked in a director level, part of many interview panels. I have seen that the other panelists are opting for a man who may be the less qualified and also less experienced than a woman counterpart. So when I start fighting with them, they always feel like woman has to give time for the caregiving, and it's a very, very difficult hurdle for a woman to enter in the managerial positions and then climb up the ladder.
Are you optimistic that things might get better? I mean, there are women like Margaret Odera, who we heard from Nairobi earlier, who are finding ways of campaigning for workers' rights, and she's started a WhatsApp group to try and do it, and Snigdha is trying to change things too. So women are fighting back, aren't they?
Women are fighting back, and I am very hopeful as someone that co-founded a movement in 2015, and now we have over 47 chapters all around the world. At the same time, though, the estimates that if we don't start doing things differently, it's going to take us at least 100 years to achieve gender equality, and per our report, we estimate over 100 years to achieve gender parity in health leadership. So imagine going through multiple generations and missing out on the expertise of the women that have the most knowledge. That means adopting radical techniques such as all-female candidate lists. We need to start having family-friendly policies so that men are taking paternity leave and that becomes the norm, and really challenge the default man bias in global health. I'm hopeful, but we can't keep doing things the same way. One woman at a time is not the way that we're going to be able to transform our health systems the way they need to be.
Rupert Dart. You're listening to Health Check from the BBC. I'm Claudia Hammond, and my guest, Professor Graham Easton, is still with me. Now, the default man bias is a good phrase. Is this something you've seen in your working life, I don't know, as a family doctor or in your jobs training doctors?
Yeah, I mean, you still have to say that in most health services, and the one I work in the National Health Service in the UK, it's still dominated in the leadership positions by men. I wonder if things are starting to change. Certainly we've got more female medical students than male as a rule, and there are lots of programs which are trying to shift things, so maybe there's change on the horizon.
Well, we'll see what happens. Now, we know that staff have taken on huge amounts of work in medical and healthcare settings, especially during the pandemic, and anywhere where there's a shortage of doctors and nurses, and the World Health Organization has been highlighting that this week. It can take a heavy toll on staff, can't it, when they're trying to cover for other people?
Absolutely. It's a huge issue. The latest estimates from this WHO forum suggest that about 50% of health and care workers who already were feeling undervalued and overworked experienced burnout during the COVID pandemic from the huge sort of additional burden. And burnout is this sort of state of physical and emotional exhaustion that often comes with healthcare work, but not exclusively that, but healthcare workers are particularly at risk.
But it can be really serious, can't it? And it can lead people to leave, which is the last thing you want, because then you've got even fewer staff.
Absolutely. It's not good for healthcare workers because it can lead to mental health problems, alcohol, drug misuse, and so on, but also not good for patients because we know that it can lead to increased levels of error. I talk to our medical students about it, and my own experience of being burnt out, which I've definitely been once at least in my career, I became very slow at making decisions. I worried about making the wrong decisions. I became detached, so less empathetic to patients, and all that can affect patient care in a bad way.
And it's a hard problem to solve, though, isn't it? Because if what you need is more staff, you've got to train those staff, and that can take years.
Absolutely. So the WHO are calling for, boosting education and training, increasing pay, improving working conditions. And this is very refreshing because historically, the way we dealt with burnout in the health service was to say, you need to toughen up, you need to be more resilient, here are some ways for you to cope better. But actually the evidence now is much more, it's about the cultures, it's about the workload, and so it's really those things that need to change.
So it's not some personal failing, it's about what's going on around you.
There are small things you can do, but you've got to pay attention to the systems.
Thanks, Graham. Now, here's an odd one. Imagine a baby who is a week old, and you know that because the baby was born a week ago. But biologically, some babies are younger than others, and it might depend on whether their mother had any complications during pregnancy. Now, it all sounds very strange, I know, but this is based on data from 1,800 babies from 12 different parts of the United States. Carrie Breton is Professor of Population and Public Health Sciences at the University of Southern California, and her team looked at women who had healthy pregnancies and compared them with women who'd experienced high blood pressure, preeclampsia or gestational diabetes. They wanted to know whether these conditions had any impact on a baby's so-called epigenetic age. So I asked Carrie what epigenetics are.
Epigenetics are considered marks that really sit upon your DNA, and they can change over time and in response to the environment around you. And so what happens is that we've looked at several of these marks that can be grouped together, and they loosely track with your chronological age. And so that is what we are calling our epigenetic age.
So in a way, it's another way of measuring our age, rather than saying, well, how much time, how many weeks, months or years have actually passed, how much has a body or a baby aged.
Right. Yeah. So it's sort of an insight into a biological age, if you will, or aging on the inside as opposed to, I guess, the outside.
And so our DNA is fixed, of course, but these marks that lie on top of the DNA can change over time.
Right. They can change in response to a lot of things around us. And really one of the things we're interested in understanding is the difference between how we measure epigenetic age and chronological age. So an interesting question is, are there things around us that might stimulate faster aging or slower aging on this epigenetic level?
And you looked at 1,800 babies and whether their mothers had had hypertension or gestational diabetes or preeclampsia while they were pregnant, and whether this made a difference to the epigenetic age of the babies, the biological age of the babies. And what did you find?
We found that indeed it did, and we saw that on average babies were about half a week younger in moms who had had either gestational diabetes during their pregnancy or preeclampsia during their pregnancy.
And is that what you expected might happen?
Actually, no. I think when we went into this, we really thought that we might see more accelerated aging. So we were a little bit surprised, but in some ways, I think it also can make sense.
Yeah, in a way it does seem to make sense, doesn't it? Because these conditions, which are not positive conditions, you could imagine might affect the way the baby develops.
Right, and if anything, slow it down, resulting in sort of less maturity.
So these were newborn babies, and in a way they are half a week younger biologically, which isn't that much time, but does this matter?
It's a $1 million question. The reality is we don't know how much it matters right now or what the downstream implications will be, because really studying epigenetic age is a relatively new concept, and there haven't been a lot of studies looking at what happens in the future.
But is half a week a short time or a long time in a way in a newborn baby's life?
I think it's a substantial amount of time in a newborn baby's life. When we measure everything in weeks, when we think about pregnancy and preterm birth is really important, and so weeks really matter, and that optimal time for development to have matured fully.
Now, you found this affected girls more than boys, which I thought was interesting. Do you have any idea why?
Well, one reason may be that female babies respond to external stressors in the womb, in a greater way, and by slowing down their maturation processes, perhaps more so than male babies. We know there's lots of hormonal differences between male and female babies in development in the womb, and there is some literature out there to suggest sex differences in maturation levels.
And you found that gestational diabetes and preeclampsia both made a difference to the baby's biological age, but it was interesting that hypertension, high blood pressure, didn't make a difference.
That's correct.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that both gestational diabetes and preeclampsia are perhaps slightly more severe conditions as pregnancy complications go, and hypertension is in fact the starting point that leads to preeclampsia if other conditions occur as well. And so it may partly just be the severity level differ, and it may also be that because hypertension has greater variability, we may have not had a big enough sample size to really detect differences.
Of course, there might be parents listening to this who've had these complications themselves. Should they be worried by these findings? I mean, if so, is there anything they can do?
Right. I would say no. I don't think moms should be worried about what their baby's epigenetic age is at this point in time. But I do think, more broadly, we already know that pregnancy complications have their own health implications. So, of course, the message to have an optimal pregnancy and to try and reduce and treat any pregnancy complications that come along is important, notwithstanding what the epigenetic age is.
So what next to build on these findings?
Well, I think, following some of these kids over time in their childhood and looking at whether their epigenetic age at birth is in fact associated with child outcomes like increased asthma risk or increased obesity risk down the line.
Carrie Breton. Now, Graham, before we go, there is a study showing that resistance to antibiotics in humans and animals is more closely related than we thought. And this reminds me of last week on Health Check, when we discussed whether there's an argument for doctors and vets to work more closely together. So these findings are just out this week in the Lancet Planetary Health. What is this telling us then about antibiotic resistance?
This is a sort of modelling study, and these researchers looked at lots of data and research around the world. As predicted, what they found was that if you increase consumption of antibiotics in animals, you tend to get increased antibiotic resistance in animals. And also, if you increase consumption of antibiotics in humans, particularly irresponsible overuse of antibiotics in humans, you get increased antibiotic resistance in humans. But what they found, which they're saying is the first time this association has been shown, is this two-way relationship between livestock animals like cattle and so on and humans. So antibiotic consumption in animals being linked to antibiotic resistance in humans and vice versa.
And did they find it varied in different parts of the world?
Well, definitely. And the other aspect to this piece of research was it wasn't just the antibiotic consumption that had an impact. So, for example, although there are low levels of antibiotic consumption in, for example, Asia, Bangladesh, China, India, they also had the highest rates of antibiotic resistance in food-producing animals like cattle and so on. So this is kind of consistent with previous research. Things like poverty linked to sanitation, access to healthcare, seem to have a big impact. It's not just how much antibiotics are consumed.
So that would suggest that as a solution to this, as well as being careful about how many antibiotics are used, that other things actually need to be done.
Exactly, and that's their big message. They're saying we need to take this one health approach. So animals don't exist on their own, humans don't exist on their own, we're all interconnected. And so, for example, boosting surveillance of antimicrobial resistance in livestock animals to match the sort of monitoring we already do in humans.
Yes, so another thing to keep an eye on there. Thank you very much, Graham Easton from Queen Mary, University of London, for joining us today. And thanks for listening to Health Check from the BBC. The producer is Paula McGrath and our studio engineer today is Steve Greenwood. I'm Claudia Hammond. Next week, how would you fancy a bit of lab-grown blood? Now, this may sound like something out of a horror film, but it could be a game changer for people with some blood conditions or even a rare blood type. We'll hear from one of the first people in the world to receive lab-grown blood in a transfusion.